Hello everyone. Today in our video we are going to continue reading some other parts of the book, and we begin today with Fantasies of Statelessness. A common thread links many of our contemporary anxieties about the future, from authoritarian backsliding in Russia to corruption in India, to failed states in the developing world to entrenched interest groups in contemporary American politics. It concerns the difficulties of creating and maintaining effective political institutions, governments that are simultaneously powerful, rule-bound, and accountable. This might seem like an obvious point that any fourth grader would acknowledge, and yet on further reflection, it is a truth that many intelligent people fail to understand. Let's begin with the question of the receding of the third wave and the democratic recession that has taken place around the world in the 2000s. The reasons for our disappointments in the failure of democracy to spread do not lie, I would agree, on the level of ideas at the present moment. Ideas are extremely important to political order. It is the perceived legitimacy of the government that binds population together and makes them willing to accept its authority. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the collapse of one of democracy's great competitors, communism, and the rapid spread of liberal democracies as the most widely accepted form of government. This is true up to the present, where democracy, in Amartya Sen's words, remains the default political condition. While democracy is not yet universally practiced, nor indeed universally accepted, and the general climate of world opinion, democratic governance has achieved the status of being taken to be generally right. Very few people around the world openly profess to admire Vladimir Putin's paternalism, or Hugo Chavez's 21st century socialism, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's Islamic Republic. No important international institution endorses anything but democracy as the basis for just governance. China's rapid growth incites envy and interest, but its exact model of authoritarian capitalism is not one that is easily described, much less emulated by other developing countries. Such is the prestige of modern liberal democracy that today's would-be authoritarians all have to stage elections and manipulate the media from behind the scenes to legitimate themselves. Not only has totalitarianism virtually disappeared from the world, authoritarians pay a compliment to democracy by pretending to be democrats. Democracy's failure then lies less in concept than in execution. Most people around the world would strongly prefer to live in a society in which their government was accountable and effective, where it delivered the sorts of service demanded by citizens in a timely and cost-effective way. But few governments are actually able to do both, because institutions are weak, corrupt, lacking capacity, or in some cases absent altogether. The passion of protesters and democracy advocates around the world, from South Africa to Korea to Romania to Ukraine, might be sufficient to bring about regime change from authoritarian to democratic government. But the latter will not succeed without a long, costly, laborious, and difficult process of institution building. There is, in fact, a curious blindness to the importance of political institutions that has affected many people over the years. People who dream about a world in which we will somehow transcend politics, this particular fantasy is not the special province of either the left or the right. Both have had their versions of it. The father of communism, Karl Marx, famously predicted the withering away of the state. Once the proletarian revolution had achieved power and abolished private property, left-wing revolutionaries from the 19th century anarchists on thought it sufficient to destroy all power structures without giving serious thought to what would take their place. This tradition continues up through the present, with a suggestion by anti-globalization authors like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri that economic injustice could be abolished by undermining the sovereignty of states and replacing it with a network multitude. Real-world communist regimes, of course, did exactly the opposite of what Marx predicted, building larger and tyrannical state structures to force people to act collectively when they fail to do so spontaneously. Real-world communist regimes, of course, did exactly the opposite of what Marx predicted building large and tyrannical state structures to force people to act collectively when they failed to do so spontaneously. This in turn led a generation of democracy activists in Eastern Europe to envision their own form of statelessness, where mobilized civil society would take the place of traditional political parties and centralized governments. These activists were subsequently disillusioned by the realization that their societies couldn't be governed without institutions, and when they encountered the messy compromises required to build them. In the decades since the fall of communism, Eastern Europe is democratic, but is not thereby necessarily happy with its politics or politicians. The fantasy of statelessness most prevalent on the right is that the market economy will somehow make government unnecessary and irrelevant. During the dot-com boom of the 100, the fantasy of statelessness most prevalent on the right is that the market economy will somehow make government unnecessary and irrelative. During the dot-com boom of the 1990s, many enthusiasts argued along the lines of the former Citibank CEO Walter Wheatstone that the world was experiencing a twilight of sovereignty, in which the political powers traditionally exercised by states were being undermined by new information technologies that were making borders impossible to police and rules difficult to enforce. The rise of the internet led activists like John Perry Barlow of the Electronic Frontier Foundation to issue a declaration of independence of cyberspace, where governments to the industrialized world were told, "You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." A global capitalist economy would replace the sovereignty of democratic governments with the sovereignty of the market. If a legislator voted for excessive regulation or restricted trade, it would be punished by the bond market and forced to adopt policies deemed rational by global capital markets. Fantasies of a stateless world have always found a sympathetic audience in the United States, where hostility to the state is a staple of American political culture. Libertarians of various stripes have suggested not just rolling back an overgrown welfare state, but also abolishing more basic institutions like the Federal Reserve Board and the Food and Drug Administration. It is quite legitimate to argue that modern governments have grown excessively large, that they thereby limit economic growth and individual freedom. People are right to complain about unresponsive bureaucracy, corrupt politicians, and the unprincipled nature of politics. But in the developed world, we take the existence of government so much for granted that we sometimes forget how important it is and how difficult it was so to create, and what the world would look like without certain basic political institutions. It is not only that we take democracy for granted, we also take for granted the fact that we have a state at all that can carry out certain basic functions. Fairfax County, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C., where I lived for many years, is one of the richest countries in the United States. Every winter, potholes appear in the country's road as a result of the seasonal freezing and thawing after winter storms. And yet, by the end of the spring, all of those potholes get magically filled, so no one has to worry about breaking an axle in one. If they don't get filled, the residents of Fairfax County get angry and complain about the incompetence of local government. No one, apart from a few specialists in public administration, ever stops to think about the complex, invisible social system that makes this possible, or why it takes longer to fill potholes in the neighboring District of Columbia, or why potholes never get filled in many developing countries. Indeed, the kinds of minimal or no government societies envisioned by dreamers of the left and right are not fantasies. They actually exist in the contemporary developing world. Many parts of sub-Saharan Africa are a libertarian paradise. The region as a whole is a low-tax utopia, with governments often unable to collect more than about 10% of GDPs in taxes, compared to more than 30% in the United States and 50% in parts of Europe. Rather than unleashing entrepreneurship, this low rate of taxation means that basic public services like health, education, and pothole filling are starved of funding. The physical infrastructure on which a modern economy rests, like roads, court system, and police, are missing in Somalia, where a strong central government in Somalia, where a strong central government hasn't existed since the late 1980s, ordinary individuals may own not just assault rifles but also rocket-propelled grenades, anti-aircraft missiles, and tanks. People are free to protect their own families and in it are forced to do so. Nigeria has a film industry that produces as many titles as India's famed Bollywood, but films have to earn a quick return because the government is incapable of guaranteeing intellectual property rights and preventing products from being copied illegally. The degree to which people in developed countries take political institutions for granted was very much evident in the way that the United States planned or failed to plan for the aftermath of its 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USA administration seemed to think that democracy and a market economy were default conditions to which the country would automatically revert once Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was removed, and seemed genuinely surprised when the Iraqi state itself collapsed in an orgy of looting and civil conflict. USA proposals that have been similarly stymied in Afghanistan, when 10 years of effort and the investment of hundreds of billions of dollars have not produced a stable, legitimate Afghan state. Political institutions are necessary and cannot be taken for granted. A market economy and high levels of wealth that magically appear when you get government out of the way. They rest on a hidden institutional foundation of property rights, rule of law, and basic political order. A free market, a vigorous civil society, the spontaneous wisdom of crowds are all important components of a working democracy, but none can ultimately replace the foundations of a strong hierarchical government. There has been a broad recognition among economists in recent years that institutions matter. Poor countries are poor not because they lack resources, but because they lack effective political institutions. We need, therefore, to better understand where those institutions come from. Getting to Denmark. The problem of creating modern political institutions has been described as the problem of getting Denmark. After the title of a paper written by two social scientists at the World Bank, Lant Pritchett and Michael Wolcock, for people in developed countries, Denmark is a mythical place that is known to have good political and economic institutions. It is stable, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and has extremely low levels of political corruption. Everyone would like to figure out how to transform Somalia, Haiti, Nigeria, Iraq, or Afghanistan into Denmark, and the international development community has long lists of presumed Denmark-like attributes that they are trying to help failed states achieve. There are many number Getting to Denmark. The problem of creating modern political institutions has been described as the problem of getting to Denmark. After the title of a paper written by two social scientists at the World Bank, Lant Pritchett and Michael Wolcock, for people in developed countries, Denmark is a mythical place that is known to have good political and economic institutions. It is stable, democratic, peaceful, good political and economic institution. It is stable, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and has extremely low levels of political corruption. Everyone would like to figure out how to transform Somalia, Haiti, Nigeria, or Iraq, and or Afghanistan into Denmark, and the international development community has long lists of presumed Denmark-alike attributes that they are trying to help failed states achieve. There are any number of problems with this agenda. It doesn't seem very plausible that extremely poor and county countries could expect to put into place complex institutions in short order, given how long such institutions took to evolve. Moreover, institutions reflect the cultural values of the societies in which they are established, and it's not clear that Denmark's democratic political order can take root in very different cultural contexts. Most people living in rich, stable, developed countries, they have no idea how Denmark itself got to Denmark. Something that is true for many Danes as well. The struggle to create modern political institutions was so long and so painful that people living in industrialized countries now suffer from a historical amnesia regarding how their societies came to that point in the first place. The Danes themselves are descended from the Vikings, a ferocious tribal people who conquered and pillaged much of Europe from the Mediterranean all the way to Kiev in southern Ukraine. The Celtic peoples who first settled to the British Isles, as well as the Romans who conquered them, and the Germanic barbarians who displaced the Romans, were all originally organized into tribes, much like those that still exist in Afghanistan, Central Iraq, and Papua New Guinea. So, where the Chinese, Indians, Arabs, Africans, and virtually all other peoples of the earth, they out primary obligation not to state but to kinfolk. They settle disputes not through courts but through a system of retributive justice, and they buried their dead on property held collectively by group of kin. Over the course of time, however, these tribal societies developed political institutions. First and foremost was the centralized source of authority that held an effective monopoly of military power over a defined piece of territory, what we call a state. Peace was kept not by a rough balance of power between groups of kin, but by the state's army and police, now a standing force that could also defend the community against neighboring tribes and states. Property came to be owned not by groups of kinfolk, but by individuals who increasingly won the right to buy and sell it at will. The rights to that property were enforced not by kin but by courts and legal systems that had the power to settle disputes and compensate wrongs. In time, moreover, social rules were formalized as written rules and laws rather than customs or informal traditions. These formal rules were used to organize the way that power was distributed in the system, regardless of the individuals who exercised power at any given time. Institutions, in other words, replaced individuals' leaders. Those legal systems were eventually accorded a supreme authority over society, an authority that was seen to be superior to that of rulers who temporarily happened to command the state's armed forces and bureaucracy. This came to be known as the rule of law. Finally, certain societies not only limited the power of their states by forcing rulers to comply with written law, they also held them accountable to parliaments, assemblies, and other bodies representing a broader proportion of the population. Some degree of accountability was present in many traditional monarchies, but it was usually the product of informal consultation with a small body of elite advisors. Modern democracy was born when rules acceded to formal rules, limiting their power and subordinating their sovereignty to the will of the larger population as expressed through elections. The purpose of this book is to fill in some of the gaps of this historical amnesia by giving an account of where basic political institutions came from in societies that now take them for granted. The three categories of institutions in questions are the ones just described: the state, the rule of law, accountable government. A successful modern liberal democracy combines all three set of institutions in a stable balance. The fact that there are countries capable of achieving this balance constitutes the miracle of modern political. Since it is not obvious that they can be combined, the state after all, concentrates and uses power to bring about compliance with its laws on the part of its citizens and to defend itself against other states and threats. The rule of law and accountable government, on the other hand, limit the state's power, first by forcing it to use its power according to certain public and transparent rules, and then by ensuring that it is subordinate to the will of the people. These institutions came into being in the first place because people find that they can protect their interests and the interests of their family through them. But what people regard as self-interest and how they are willing to collaborate with others depends critically on ideas that legitimate certain forms of political association. Self-interest and legitimate thus form the cornerstones of political order. The fact that one of these three types of institutions exists doesn't imply that the others do so as well. Afghanistan, for example, has held democratic elections since 2004, but has an extremely weak state and is unable to uphold laws in much of its territory. Russia, by contrast, has a strong state and holds democratic elections, but its rulers do not feel bound by a rule of law. The nation of Singapore has both strong state and the rule of law bequeathed to it by its former British colonial masters, but only an unaudited form of democratic accountability. Where did these three sets of institutions originally come from? What were the forces that drove their creation and the conditions under which they developed? In what order were they created? And how did they relate to one another? If we could understand how these basic institutions came into being, we could then perhaps better understand the distance that separates Afghanistan or Somalia from contemporary Denmark. The story of how political institutions developed cannot be told without understanding the contemporary process of political decay. There are several reasons to be dissatisfied with existing literature on the development of political institutions. First, much of it is not comparative on sufficiently broad scale. It is only by comparing the experience of different societies that we can begin to sort through complex causal factors that explain why certain institutions emerge in some places but not in others. A lot of theorizing about modernization, from the massive studies of Karl Marx to contemporary economic historians like Douglas North, has focused heavily on the experience of England as the first country to industrialize. The English experience was exceptional in many ways, but is not necessarily a good guide to development in countries differently situated. The multicultural approaches that have displaced this narrative in recent decades are not for the most part seriously comparative. They tend to select either positive stories of how non-Western civilizations have contributed to the overall progress of humankind, or else negative ones about how they were victimized. One seldom finds serious comparative analysis of why an institution developed in one society but not in another. The great sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset used to say that an observer who knows only one country knows no countries. Without comparison, there is no way of knowing whether a particular practice or behavior is unique to the society in question or common to many. Only through comparative analysis is it possible to link causes like geography, climate, technology, religion, or conflict to the range of outcomes existing in the world today? In doing so, we might be able to answer questions like the following: why are Afghanistan, the jungle regions of India, the island nations of Melanesia, and parts of the Middle East still tribally organized? Why is China's default condition to be ruled by a strong centralized government, while India has never been the degree of centralization except for very brief periods over the past 3 millennia of its story? Why is it that almost all of the cases of successful authoritarian modernization countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China are clustered in East Asia rather than in Africa or the Middle East? Why have democracy and a strong rule of law taken root in Scandinavia, while Russia, subject to similar climatic and geographical conditions, experienced the growth of unconstrained absolutism? Why have countries in Latin America been subjected to high inflation and economic crisis repeatedly over the past century, while the United States and Canada have not. The historical data presented in this book are interesting precisely because they shed light on the present and explain how different political orders come to be. But human societies are not trapped by their past. If modern states emerged in China or Europe as a result of certain factors like the constant need to prepare for the fight wars, this doesn't necessarily mean that weak states in Africa today must replicate this experience if they are to demodernize. Indeed, I will argue in the volume 2 that the conditions for political development today are very different from what they were in the periods covered by the volume 1. The social deck is being constantly shuffled by economic growth and international factors, impinge to a much greater extent on individual societies than they did in the past. So while the historical material in this book may explain how different societies got to where they are now, their paths to the present do not determine their futures or serve as models for other societies. So this is all for this video and for today reading. We will see next time with new parts that I'm going to read for you. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe, of course, to share and like, and see you.